Well, we'll go ahead and get started since it's 5:15, and I think we're going to have a ton to talk about. Welcome everyone in the state to the second California Thoracic Society's ICU Surge weekly meeting. My name is Asha Devereaux, and I'm going to serve as the facilitator of a conversation with all of you intensivists and other experts that we're bringing in to help us solve some problems that we're already starting to face. So welcome and thank you for your time. And I want everybody on the call to know that they are welcome to participate in the chat, as well as participate in the conversation. There'll be plenty of opportunities. First of all, California Thoracic Society wouldn't be able to do this unless we had somebody to help us support our platform and conversation. But so we thank Fisher & Paykel, SmartVest, and Ventec. So we appreciate their support. So for today, just wanted to let you know what our agenda is. We've already kind of gone over the purpose of the meeting. As we go through our massive COVID surges and anticipated peak, some of the solutions that we're coming up with will need to have our statewide collaboration. And this will hopefully offer that framework for those conversations. Doctors Amundsen and Christensen, Denny's in Southern California, Christian is in, or Sandrock, sorry, is in Northern California. And they really are the moderators of this conversation. They both are in the ICU taking care of all these COVID patients and surges. And so I look forward to that. And we invite others on the call to share what's going on in their ICUs. Just a brief update today, one slide on what is the incident command system. And if you're running out of stuff, what's a Mohawk and what does that mean and how do you get stuff? And then I'd love to introduce you to Dr. Arzu Salome from CalMat and EMSET, and then Dr. Nicholas Hill will be talking to us about high flow nasal cannula. All of you know about that, but hopefully about some questions we have now that some of our supplies for high flow nasal cannula are approaching shortages, and what kind of troubleshooting MacGyver methods we can start using. If time permits, staffing ratios and some other questions. I'll go ahead and start for a minute discussion on the hospital incident command system. Many folks in the ICU aren't aware that when a disaster has been declared since March, there's a command center that's been set up, and usually it's in the CEO, Chief Operating Officer or CEO's office. And they had chief nursing officer, the chief medical officer, they're probably having daily briefings. And the usual structure of the function of the hospital changes into this mode. By state law, every hospital system in California is expected to be in this mode currently. That way, when the state comes to assist, they know that you've got folks who are assigned into these roles. Now, the Mohawk is a term a lot of people are using right now when you need to get a resource. So what happens, and this is something that it's published in Disaster Medicine Public Health Preparedness that we had put together in San Diego County in March, and when we were planning for our crisis care. So each of those hospital incident command systems that I had shown you now will be in a region collaborating if everything is hitting the fan like it is. And then they will have immediate relationships with the medical operations center of your county public health department. And in our region, we have, and that falls under the umbrella of the Emergency Ops Center. And then this is something that we had formed in March, but it's not really present right now as a committee. But I just thought this would be a good visual in terms of how hospitals can communicate to public health a resource request. And then San Diego County or any county submits that request to the state, and they've got regular calls. And that is how remdesivir has arrived to hospitals and all the other resources, as well as ventilators and tubing. And so with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Dr. Amundsen and Dr. Sandrock, who will discuss the state of the ICUs.
Okay. Well, Denny, I guess I'll go first and start with the North, which I will say as a preamble that I'm certainly not an expert. Asha is very kind, but I'm not an expert in much. And for any of you listening in, if you want to chime in about the status of your hospital in Central or Northern California, please do chime in. We, at least in our region here, and it's great seeing the incident command system in the MOAC in place, because that's where a lot of our communication is supposed to go through, but doesn't always successfully happen as smoothly as we would like. But currently right now, I can speak for UC Davis. We are obviously at 0% ICU capacity. Our entire hospital is at 0%. We are in a mid-surge level of our plan, so a surge level 4. What that does mean for us is that all of our ICU beds are filled. We are using some of our ICU patients in non-traditional areas, so such as keeping them in the emergency room longer, keeping them for greater than 24 hours in the cath lab is an example. Some post-op cases staying overnight in the PACU. However, we have not advanced our surge plan to expand into other areas yet. And those would be step-down units where they'd have more difficult to manage patients on mechanical ventilation, or the PACU, for example. So that we seem to be emblematic of what many of the hospitals in our region are doing, where we have not surged upwards into non-traditional areas, but we're sort of bursting at the seams in our traditional areas and making do with some, unorthodox places like the ED, cath lab, PACU, which makes us a little uncomfortable. So that's generally our bed status. Equipment status, mostly we're relatively doing okay. So the shortages in either oxygen or other equipment that you have down in the South has not quite fully hit us across the board, although we are, getting close in some of those areas, but not fully. And then lastly, we've started, I know for our institution and some of our surrounding hospitals, and we worked with the MOAC this week, we did a large tabletop exercise of our crisis standards of care just to see, okay, is everybody ready? If we actually fire up the tents, we have our multiple triage officers, both in the ED, ICU, we have our administrative team, and more importantly, our legal and bioethics team. Are they ready to go and ready to not only triage, but have that larger command and control structure under crisis standards of care? We did drill that, and of course, found areas of learning and improvement. I know a few of our larger hospital systems have done the same as well, but no one's enacted that as far as I know up here, and no one is triaging for allocation of any resources thus far. Last thing I will mention is there is some variability at what we would call canceling of elective procedures in order to increase capacity. Defining an elective procedure is always one fraught with debate and can lead to a nice fist fight with some surgeons. But generally, such things, some of our health systems here have, for example, canceled elective EGDs, colonoscopies, screening colonoscopies, and other non-essential surgeries. There are some that are still doing a few of those and pushing forward. So we do have a little variability across the health systems here in Northern California. And I would say that's about the 30,000 foot view of the status we have right now. So I'll let Denny go. If any of you guys have any other questions, feel free to chime in on the chat or other areas to give an update at your hospital if you're in that region.
Thanks, Christian. I thought I was going to be able to send them up to you. So it sounds bad up there. So we are too.
It always is. It depends what you define as bad. We're not as bad as you. So, but that's about where we're at on our main dashboard from the MOAC.
Yeah. Last time I want to reiterate something that the people on this call are experts in their field and they have a lot of experience. And last time we got a lot of good questions and more afterwards, but boy, I would challenge people to give us your problems, tell us about what's going on. I think that's the best format for this kind of a discussion and on a room to kind of lay bare some of your problems. I also see that we have some of our command leaders on the call, and I would defer to them if they want to chime in about where we sit. Remember, I'm in a Scripps 5 hospital system, and We also have our triggers for where we'll end up with crisis critical care. We run somewhere in the range of mid 400s to mid 500s of COVID patients, with maybe 110 to 120 in the ICU. So today we had our critical care director meeting, and we've also set up along with our command center, a crisis triage team that is a one call gets all for actually staff and stuff. It's been utilized once. It was a 20-minute turnaround to get what was needed at one of our companion hospitals, and it worked fairly well. At our call today, we're looking at probably not having ventilator issues. I don't know, Christian, if you are. Looking at our problem is going to be staffed beds. I think that's where this is. We went to team nursing. We went to not quite all the way to alternate care, but we've expanded our care into areas that had not been used as intensive care. In our case, we have the potential to take our 24-bed ICU to 35 and still be in the range of being able to take care, but staffing will become an issue. I think that we're kind of similar. Monday was bad days for here, and it just depends on the ripple effect with ours. As you see, and probably as you're having up there, these people tend to spend a substantial amount of time in our intensive care units. So you're really taking a 24 or a 50 bed or whatever you got ICU and putting 25 or 30 patients for 22 days in the ICU on a mechanical ventilator. Really, you're working out of a 10 to 15 to 20 bed ICU, and that's where our capacity is gonna think, in my mind, and we'll have to see how we go with augmenting our ability to staff our beds. But setting up the command center and having the triage team and a one call seems to be helping us. And again, because we're a 5 hospital system, and my particular facility sits 6 miles from the Otay Mesa border crossing, we've been able to decompress substantially by transfers, intra-hospital transfers, which has really been the saving grace for us down here. It's been just mind-blowing to be able to call somebody and have them just say yes without any kind of blowback, and the patient's gone, and it opens a bed for us. And that's kind of how we've been able to decompress through this system.
Yeah, I think, Danny, you bring up good points. I will say, I'm looking here now just to get a sense at our census in the ICU. We have 100 ICU beds, but at least 33 of those are patients who've been with us for greater than 45 days of mechanical ventilation. So I think, you're looking, and the 100 beds also obviously include surgical, trauma, pediatrics, and so forth. So that's just not the medical, which is where most of our patients with COVID would end up. But that's a big issue. It doesn't really give us a lot of wiggle room, and they just sit there indefinitely on mechanical ventilation. It's hard. That's
been our fallback, as we end up with these people and kind of live with them and their families, for sure.
It definitely seems like the North and South are getting similar. How about, is there anybody from Los Angeles? I'm looking to see if Janine made it on, but I do know that Laren's on, and he's at Loma Linda. Tell us what's going on there.
Thank you, Asha. Very similar to what Christian actually stated. We're also busting at the seams. Today, I know that we've had a little bit more wiggle room where we're actually entertaining transfers, especially from El Centro, and also our sister hospital in Murrieta too. But the issue also we are experiencing is not necessarily with ventilators, but also with staffing issues. I think that's across the board as to what others are actually experiencing. So that's the current state right now, at least within Loma Linda.
Lori Laird, are you, what's happening at UC San Francisco?
So I have the picture from UCSF. We have a total of 77 patients in the hospital, 27 in ICU, 16 on a ventilator, 1 on ECMO. in terms of we've started to come a little bit down from our peak. So we're doing okay. We're considered surge status red. Haven't scheduled elective procedures is some of what we're doing, but in terms of how we're doing, we're hanging in there.
Yeah, Asha, hi, this is Shazia.
Hi, Shazia.
Thank you for Danny for providing Scripps update. As he mentioned, there are 5 hospitals and I work at Scripps Green and Scripps Memorial Hospital. And one of the things I wanted to share with everyone that really helped us is our subspecialists have started taking care of their own patients when they admit. So our gastroenterologists, hepatologists, even transplant surgeons are taking care of their own patients. And that has tremendously helped us as ICU doctors and pulmonary service. So I wanted to add that and say that that has been very helpful. In terms of these 2 hospitals, Scripps Green, right now I'm working in the ICU. We are 24-bed hospital. We're 23-bed, all full. We have 1 code bed. And at the Scripps Memorial, we actually extended and made 2 new ICUs, which are a total of 18 beds on top of 59 beds.
Thanks, Shazia. And are those full?
Yes. We just had a little bit less patients, unfortunately, because of the fact that several of them were on comfort care as of last night and they expired. And I'm talking about Scripps Memorial Hospital. So a little bit less compared to what we have been dealing with all this week. But we do get transfers from throughout San Diego as well as outside San Diego, such as Yuma and other places such as Las Vegas. So we do get filled up pretty fast.
Thanks, Shazia. It looks like Dr. Gomez is at San Francisco General.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for allowing me to participate. Yeah, so I'm at San Francisco General, and this is our 3rd surge, I think, since February. The status of our hospital is the hospital's in condition red. Our ICU is faring a little bit better from a COVID standpoint, although we're above capacity, our usual capacity, given trauma and other sort of non-COVID medical illnesses. So we're basically dipping into our reserves from a bed standpoint. We, like other hospitals, we are ready to expand into the PACU if we have to with non-COVID patients to use the native ICU more for COVID. We've only had to do that a little bit in between Christmas and New Year's. We did that for a few days, but otherwise sort of that's where we are. And I think I'll echo what everyone else is saying, that our, it's really the nursing staffing and physician staffing more than anything else that is going to cause us problems if this continues to go on for, more than 2 months. We're hoping that it doesn't, but that's always a possibility. So I just thought I'd share that. Our incident command center has been up and running since February, so and pretty much every day nonstop since then. So that's sort of the 20,000 foot view from where we are.
Thank you very much. It's very, very useful. Anybody else? Anyone from the Los Angeles area? I know everyone's probably busy there.
Asha,
Yes, Larry.
there is Kevin Metcalf. He is the CEO actually from Memorial Hospital of Gardena. I actually invited him to be able to provide a little bit of that update about what his hospital is going through. So I just want to give a brief introduction to him. And Kevin, if you'd be okay to share with us your experience.
No, thank you, Dr. Tan. I appreciate it. Yes, we're sort of at the epicenter here in LA County, Memorial Hospital of Gardena, 173 bed acute care hospital. And on November 1st, we had 1 COVID positive patient in our hospital, and we peaked at 75. Intensive care unit of 10 beds. We're running right now 28 patients. So it's really stressed our system from multiple angles. Luckily, we have enough ventilators, but the issue we've been running into is staffing. As a matter of fact, on the way home today, I was pleasantly surprised that we actually are getting 14 National Guard nurses on Monday morning. So this is really very good for us. But we're being hit pretty hard in some of the underserved communities. Our other hospital in Huntington Park is being slammed with COVID. It's an 80-bed hospital that runs probably 50 patients a day, COVID positive. So these communities are really being devastated. Mortality rates are very high. We don't have some of the sophistication. I wish I had Dr. Tan in my hospital. I certainly could use an intensivist. 80% of the patients on ventilators. Luckily, we bought 50 new ventilators after the second surge. And so we have plenty of ventilators. But the most frightening thing, I think, and I'm about ready to be interviewed on Fox 11, is the shortage of oxygen that we're finding in Los Angeles County. I don't know if that's what you're seeing in your neck of the woods, but with all the high flow oxygen that is being delivered now in our hospitals, we've gone from once a month supplies to once every 3 days and falling. And what we're finding is the oxygen companies, we have to call them. My oxygen is good through Sunday evening, so I'm due a delivery Sunday morning, but I'm going to start calling tomorrow just to assure that we're going to get that delivery, and that they actually fill our bulk oxygen tanks up with oxygen and don't give us a half of a tank so that they can get oxygen to other hospitals. So this to me is probably the most frightening thing in the pandemic. The morgues are full. I've got 2 freezers. I've got a 6-bed morgue. I had to bring in 2 freezers. We had 75 deaths in the month of December, whereas we usually have maybe 10, 11. And it's really pretty devastating, pretty hard on the staff, the physicians. In addition, we have a lot of elderly physicians that are in high-risk groups. So they're hesitant to really get aggressive in these rooms with these patients. So it's been amazing. I've been in the business 44 years. I'm a critical care nurse by background many, many years ago, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in my career.
Oh my goodness. Well, we hope this forum will at least help us generate support, mutual support, resilience, get resources to you. Anybody else on?
Could I ask a question about the oxygen supply?
Yes.
You know what? Coming from an East Coast perspective, we're using a lot of high flow, but our oxygen supplies are in pretty good shape, and it's the delivery of oxygen within the hospital that is thought to be the problem. And I saw an article in the LA Times from December 29th that talked about this a little bit, that when you're running these very high flows, it stresses the infrastructure. You can get freezing of your vaporizers, which reduces flow, and then you have to maintain pressure, and especially upper floors, it's hard to maintain 50 PSI pressure. Are those issues that you're encountering?
Yes, absolutely. We've put a sprinkler system out at the bulk tank to avoid what you just said. That's pretty dangerous too for that to happen. Plus, we have folks that are checking that every few hours on a rotating basis to make sure that doesn't happen. But yeah, we're a 7-story hospital, so I hadn't thought about that as it relates to maintaining the PSI that high. I need to check on that. The other thing is just simple things like leaving flow meters on in rooms or leakage. I think Dr. Tan and I were talking about the anesthesia ventilator having that particular issue. These are things that, gee whiz, I never would have thought about that would be important in this environment where we're not used to having the high flow at the rate that we're having. So yes, that's something we need to check on, especially the upper floors, because our ICU is on the 4th floor, where most of the ventilator patients are.
Hey, this is Rich Branson. Nick, the issue isn't really the floor; it's the diameter of the piping. So regardless of where your ICU is, when it was built, the oxygen pipes heading to your ICU were meant to meet the demand of ventilators. Of course, most hospitals weren't built before we started doing high flow nasal cannula, but if you try to expand high flow nasal cannula to the ward you usually house the postpartum mothers who are normal, in very short order, you'll draw too much flow and the pressure will fall and you start getting alarms at zone valves. So it's not always just really the position, but again, the initial design of the hospital, and you kind of have to get in with your clinical engineering people. And yeah, the Rob Chapman from Cleveland Clinic has been looking into this, and it seems like if more than 50% of your vaporizer coils are covered in ice, you need to de-ice them. Otherwise, you're at risk of the liquid getting to a point where it freezes the valves and shuts off oxygen to your entire hospital. And Nick, I have to tell you, we talked last week on this call. You know, so many people have kind of gotten to the really high flow with the nasal cannula, 40, 60 liters a minute. And you know, what's the best way to titrate it? Because it's not just the flow, right? It's the impact of the flow. And we even talked about, well, what if you put a simple mask over the nasal cannula to kind of increase the reservoir? So I know you're going to talk about high-flow nasal cannula recently, but you know, I was worried if we started turning down the HFNC to save on the oxygen and put a mask on to increase the reservoir, we might lose some of the positive effects of high-flow nasal cannula on lung volumes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rich. Yeah, I will get back to the issue of flow in my comments a little later.
I think that's a great segue to talk about what California State is doing. And I'd like to introduce a young woman who is now gradually becoming, or rapidly becoming, an expert on the disaster SNS events. She is at the state warehouse, Dr. Arzu Salome. She's a recent emergency physician graduate and working on her MPH, and hired by the state to oversee and provide medical consultation for the equipment that's arriving. And talking to her is just exciting because she is testing all of the equipment before it reaches your hospitals. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Arzu Salome. And Arzu, do you have any pictures you need to share?
I do have pictures. I wasn't able to share it earlier. I tried sending a text to you. I'm sorry. It was
sorry. Just tell us what you're doing and
yeah,
we'll get it.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. And thank you for having me. I have been working with here with the state since the kind of like the early after the summer, and just seeing how I can consult and help and lead anyway as far as medical informations are concerned with the equipment that we bought. The state has bought over 10 different manufacturing types of ventilators, over about 14,000 in total. And since summertime, or since actually April, the team here alongside a biomedical engineers, 2 respiratory therapists, we've gone through 14,000 vents, certifying them, making sure that they work properly, that they have the right equipment, that they get stocked up and are properly set and ready to send out to the hospitals that do need them. Since then, I've encountered a lot of different types of vents that I've never seen in my life, that we are trying to learn to see if we can use them in any capacity if we do get to that shortage point. I've seen transfer ventilators that we're trying to MacGyver, as Asha says, into full-time ventilators. We're trying to use bi-level CPAP machines to try to manipulate them to see if we can use them as ventilators as well. So far, our favorite ventilator has been the Voxen. We've been getting a lot of requests from them, but we are learning to play with it and with all the displays that it's got. Along with all that, we also do have everything else that the state has bought for as medical equipment, was as far as our stat machines and other medical equipment that we are stacking up on our ACS sites. And just recently, we were in charge of finding a solution to our oxygen supply shortage. And it has been the logistics team here that has come up with the idea of creating oxygen depots all around the state with the use of deployable oxygen concentrators. So right now, we actually have a depot in Riverside County where we have 2 big oxygen concentrators called the EDOX 80 and EDOX 120, where we're able to connect them to about 10 H tanks and fill them with all 10 of them in a span of 24 hours. And I do know that that is an issue right now with everyone else, is the contracts and getting everyone's original oxygen suppliers to be able to fill their oxygen tank in an appropriate amount of time. And so if there is a lag, these depots have been set up so that we can bypass that to those people in the county. Again, we are working on trying to open up 7 other ones, but the one that is up and running right now is in Riverside County. If you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
That is, let me just add, that is so important, because I can tell you we are having delays of getting patients out of the acute care hospital because of inability to get oxygen at home. And it is really creating as the surge happens, we have no beds, but patients can't go home. So that's great to know.
And we are trying to expand all our home health oxygen concentrators as well. We have acquired more, and they are being certified here with our engineers as well as our respiratory therapists. And once they are out, we do make them available to be requested from the state. So hopefully we can expand even more. I do know that there is a huge demand, but we are working on it, and we're finding other ways and other avenues to make things available for our patients here in the state.
Quick question.
This is Rich again.
Using concentrators to fill H tanks, how are you monitoring the FiO2?
Actually, right now, for the teams that are with that with our depots, we do have an engineer that is down there, and they have I'm exactly certain exactly how they are monitoring it, but the machine, especially EDOX, is a brand new machine that does give that statistical analysis on the pressure and the FiO2 that's coming out of it. We also do have about a team of 7 engineers that are alongside those oxygen that also help fill that. And then we have a monitoring gauge that our engineers give down to follow up and to make sure that there is the purity as well as the quantity inside these tanks.
This is Rich Branson. I spoke to some of the manufacturers of portable oxygen concentrators about this issue, and DeVilbiss and others, and they say they're making them as fast as they possibly can, and they don't just have demand from the U.S. but from the rest of the world. So everything they make goes off the line and into a box and gets shipped out. So it's going to continue to be a shortage. And I know, Asha has my son's father-in-law is in New Mexico and has been on home oxygen in an apartment with his own SpO2 monitor, maintaining his own oxygenation, turning up the flow and down the flow on his concentrator. So we certainly are doing things that are really interesting.
Hey, Rich, to put some context to that volume, one manufacturer I spoke with, they're making 42,000 units a month.
Wow.
I've got a picture up here from what the O2 tanks look like that are pre-positioned by the state at the alternate care sites. So FYI, so you guys kind of have a visual. I think ours is, what she's doing a lot more. The state also is piloting a home oxygen program where they will have, I think, paramedics rounding on some folks so they can discharge from the ACS or hospitals, and the state will provide the oxygen and the support and help wean them. I think this is good for this group to know. So now next, Laren, if you'll do the honors. We're honored to have Dr. Nicholas Hill talk to us about high flow nasal cannula, where we've been getting lots of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas Hill, for being here. Dr. Nicholas Hill is professor of medicine at Tufts University. For a lot of us, or everybody, just want to let everybody also know that he was ATS's president in 2011 2012. He'll be helping us to be able to troubleshoot a lot of things with high flow nasal cannula. So thank you, Dr. Hill, for being here.
So I've been asked to make some comments about non-invasive ventilatory techniques and focusing on high flow. And I was told to keep it short and to allow a lot of time for discussion. So that's my main mission here. And I do work with some of the manufacturers, and these are my disclosures. So I wanted to address a few questions, and probably won't get to all of them just now. I just want to show a relatively few number of slides, and it sort of initiate a discussion more than anything else. I know people have been using a lot of high flow and have gained experience, and I think it would be most interesting to let everybody talk about it, and maybe we can all learn together. So one of the questions I was asked to address is when to start high flow, and some of you may have seen an article that I co-wrote with Sahel Rowe from Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, Stefano Nava, and Charles Carpati, also from Lenox Hill. And I can sum up what we thought about starting non-invasive strategies in this algorithm. I don't know why this thing is bouncing around, sorry, that we published in that article that was published in Chest, I think toward the end of 2020. And basically we were thinking of this as a three-step process where with step one, patient comes in with relatively mild hypoxemia and gets started on standard nasal cannula. And if their oxygen saturation can be maintained above 92% or so on up to 6 liters, there's really no need to escalate to anything else. But when you start getting up above 6 liters, your ability to increase FiO2 with standard nasal prongs is going to be limited. And so you face some choices, and some people recommend going to a non-rebreather mask. And then you have the choice of when the PF ratio gets into the mild ARDS to moderate ARDS range, of using either high flow, non-invasive, or adding awake proning. And I think you could debate a lot on which of those you should go with. We're hearing about oxygen shortages related to high flow, and so maybe we should rethink the use of non-invasive ventilation in these patients. But what we have been doing, because we haven't been facing the same kinds of severe oxygen shortages you have, and we're using a lot of high flow, so we're very comfortable with it, is once we get above 6 liters, we skip the NRB step and generally go to high flow as our first intervention. As you'll see, there are places that are using CPAP or BiPAP instead of high flow under these circumstances. And the fact of the matter is we don't have great data to tell us which is better. We commonly combine them. That, you know, we really shouldn't be thinking of this as binary. High flow is an excellent oxygenator, partly by virtue of its keeping up with inspiratory airflow, but also by flushing out the just exhaled air. And so you get enriched oxygenated gas when you inhale with high flow. But in fact, CPAP and BiPAP are more effective oxygenators on average in people with ARDS, because they are able to maintain a higher mean airway pressure. And so it is reasonable to consider using CPAP in these people. And one of the major limitations of mask non-invasive ventilation, of course, is limited tolerance. Most people are not going to be able to use it 24/7, whereas non-invasive is much better tolerated. And so using them in a complementary fashion makes some sense. Patients may need the added pressure to maintain their O2 sats, but they need breaks. They may be able to eat. They may want to interact with even if we're keeping loved ones out of the hospital, but they can speak on an iPad, and it may be giving them a break, adds to the quality of their in-hospital existence. Step 3, which I left off here, is patients who go to mechanical ventilation. And there are some patients, of course, who come in so ill and deteriorate so rapidly that you skip the non-invasive steps and go right to intubation. Early on in the pandemic, of course, in New York in particular, the feeling was that because of the concern about aerosol, that you should go right to intubation. But I think that's been pretty much dropped by the wayside, and the outcomes in some places that did that on mechanical ventilation were horrendous, especially coming out of China. I wanted to make a couple of comments about the Virology study, which is a pre-COVID study looking at high flow compared to non-invasive ventilation and also to standard oxygen. And I don't want to belabor this because probably most people have seen it, but they randomized high flow versus standard oxygen versus NIV. And one of the things that's notable, and just to underscore one of the points I've made, was that when you compared the actual FiO2 achieved using high flow versus non-invasive, you can see it's 82% versus 67%. And this is just an illustration of how the non-invasive actually did a better job of oxygenating here. And as most people know, high flow came out ahead on this in terms of mortality, ventilator-free days, although overall the intubation rate, which was the main outcome variable, was not statistically significantly different. So in fact, you could consider this a negative study, but the mortality outcome is what got everybody's attention. And this study has not been replicated. And one of the things that was a consequence of this study was that there was increasing recognition that having higher tidal volumes during non-invasive ventilation might have contributed to the worse outcome in terms of mortality in the NIV group. But if you look at their initial target, it was 7 to 10 milliliters per kilogram. So when they ended up with 9.2 in their NIV group, milliliters per kilogram, ideal body weight, you could argue that they kind of stacked this study against non-invasive ventilation by achieving these high tidal volumes. Of course, they didn't measure tidal volumes in the high flow group. It's not easy to do. There's been a little bit of data on use of NIV support in the COVID pandemic. Most of the data, to sum it up in one word, is garbage. And this, particularly the stuff that came out of China, it's really hard to make any sense out of it, other than that they used some of their centers used non-invasive techniques in a fairly substantial percentage of patients. But when you try to slice and dice the data and figure out what the actual outcomes were, it's daunting, to say the least. But there are a couple of studies that I think are of some note, and one was Stefano Nava's study out of northern Italy from 9 hospitals. And this was a non-ICU study. The pulmonologists in Italy don't take care of critical care patients. Once they go to the ICU, they go mainly to the anesthesia-trained intensivist. So they had patients whose saturation had dipped under 94% and were tachypnic and had a PF ratio of greater than 200. They excluded less than 200 or anybody who needed an ICU. They had dedicated COVID wards. When they looked at their data post hoc, they found that about a quarter of the patients had used high flow. About a quarter of the patients used standard non-invasive bi-level type ventilation, and 50% used the helmet CPAP. So their approach is very, very different than what we used in our hospital system. And I think the conversation I'm hearing from California is, again, that high flow seems to be the most popular mode. And it's hard to make sense out of their outcomes. There were similar 30-day mortalities, although with high flow, they actually got, in absolute terms, about half the mortality, 16% versus 30 in both the other groups, CPAP and NIV. But the use of high flow was maybe selected for somewhat milder patients. And so I don't really think you can make much out of that difference. And the intubation rates were very similar. The lengths of stays were very similar. They also looked at the rate of positivity in their healthcare workers because of the concern about spread of aerosol and whether these things are spreading infection. And they concluded that there is a risk for staff infection. 42 of their staff, or 12%, did become positive. A dozen of them became ill. Stefano Nava was one of them, but he amongst the others recovered well. But they don't really know where these staff members got infected. And in our experience in Boston, it looks like to us most of the people who got infected probably got it in the community. And during our initial surge in the spring, only one of our 50 respiratory therapists became infected, and virtually none of our nurses and literally none of our ICU staff physicians. We had a few fellows get infected, but two of them had been in Vail the week before they got infected. One other notable study was out of Paris, where they looked at results in 4 ICUs with 379 patients. So it's a very different population. But here they took patients with acute respiratory failure, and they started out on nasal oxygen and went through the transition. 39% of them received high flow, and they looked at outcomes in patients who got high flow versus none. And after propensity matching, there was a significant reduction in the need for invasive mechanical ventilation. As you can see there, 55 versus 72%. But again, no difference in 28-day mortality. And they did not mention code status. And some of the people who went on non-invasive undoubtedly stayed on it because they weren't candidates for intubation. We've started to look at our data at Tufts, and what's the things I want to point out here are that we put 40% of our patients coming in with incipient hypoxemic respiratory failure on some non-invasive mode. We used NIV with a full face mask in 8%. We used the helmet CPAP in 1%, and then 40% with high flow. And we also often used high flow in combination with NIV, sometimes with a cough assist, because these people are weak and they have a lot of secretions after they're several weeks intubated or more sometimes. This approach was well received by physicians. Again, it's hard to make sense out of the outcomes. And on the left here, you can see the in-hospital death rates in our patients. In the blue on the far left is invasive mechanical ventilation. We had a mortality rate of 25%, which is pretty good compared to what has been reported. Non-invasive, just under 10%. And then just getting into the ICU yielded comparable mortality rates because most of those patients did end up getting intubated. Now, I wanted to make a few comments about aerosol dispersion because this did heavily influence the use of intubation, the selection of non-invasive devices. And as everybody, I'm sure, knows, the recommendations from guideline groups and the various august bodies making recommendations were all over the map. And some of them recommended high flow. The Society of Critical Care Medicine Surviving Sepsis campaign document actually said high flow is not an aerosol generating procedure. But then other places, including the Mass General in Boston, said that these should be used only in very unusual situations and stay away from them because of the aerosol concern. And what we're looking at here is dispersion of aerosol that from David Wee's lab in Hong Kong. And this work has gotten a lot of attention over the years. And he uses a mannequin of smoke via benchtop ventilators and dispersion detected of the smoke detected by laser beams. And so basically it is a measure of air currents. It doesn't actually tell you whether there's virus, and it doesn't really tell you the nature of the aerosol as it's generated by the device. But what you can see is on top there, the NIV dispersed about a meter in distance, and at the bottom there, second from the bottom is high flow, which just got over 10 centimeters. So high flow did not generate a lot of flow as long as the device was properly fit. And this is some of the data that from his lab, where you can see in the lighter colored plumes there above the mannequin that on the left, for example, you have high flow, far left is 10 liters, and just to the right of that is 60 liters. And it doesn't really make much difference whether you go from 10 to 60 liters, it's about the same. And on the right, the two columns are for CPAP, which wasn't too much different here. And then another study, Charlie Atwood, many of us know was part of this study, but they just put a standard surgical mask over the high flow cannula, and they were able to markedly diminish the plume generated by a high velocity nasal insufflation device. That's a vapotherm device, by having the mask, as you can see over on the left, that plume is eliminated. And my friend Felix Kusid from New York, a respiratory therapist, at least some of you undoubtedly know, has come up with a shovel mask that he's put on these patients to diminish the plume. And this is actually being marketed now by Vapotherm as Felix One, but you can actually just grab a shovel mask out of your closet and use that. And then there's this meta-analysis that was put together mainly by data from the SARS-1 epidemic. And what you see here is that intubation has a very high odds ratio. And I think everybody agrees that intubation generates a significant amount of aerosol. Putting in a trach does, a bronchoscopy does. NIV sort of in the middle, but high flow, again, is at the bottom of this, and it's not really generating that much. And this is data that we have put together. We've been doing some studies with the aerosol scientists at the Lincoln Labs at MIT, and this is using a couple of different devices. But what we're seeing here in the red is one aerosol collector, and in the blue, another one. And the device was put on healthy volunteers in a room that was supposed to resemble what you might get in a hospital, where you'd have 6 to 12 air exchanges per hour. And on the left, there's a red spike, and that is some aerosol that was put into the chamber as a positive control. And then over on, as you go across there, basically the bottom line is that for high flow and for bi-level non-invasive ventilation with a filter in place, you couldn't detect aerosol over background, except when patients were coughing, laughing. That's what those arrows indicate. And on the left, there's a little spike, and that was when the device, the high flow device, was first started up. And it turns out as the humidifier heats up, there's a little bit of droplet that forms, but during the rest of the time. You cannot detect aerosol over background. Sheena has wrote a letter about a different study using some different techniques in healthy volunteers and found the same thing. So these things do not generate that much aerosol to begin with. And the other thing that's missing here is the virology, and we're actually collaborating with the virology lab at Tufts to determine whether there is viable virus. And the answer, basically, it's very, very hard to detect it. So we may have been overreacting to a lot of these things. And certainly careful PPE remains important. I wanted to make a few more comments here, and I don't want to extend things much longer, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with the helmet. This is a C-long that is actually approved for administration of bariatrics. But the last thing I wanted to talk about was flow. What kind of flow should we be using? And this is from Stanislav Tatkov's study in the Journal of Applied Physiology some years ago, but he's using a Fisher-Paykel device using a mannequin head, a plastic mold made from normal human CT scan. And what you're looking at is time and elimination of these aerosolized labeled particles in red in the nasopharynx at 15, 30, and 45 liters. And if we go through that again, you'll see that at 45 liters, let's see, if I can stop it. Well, let me go through there one more time. And let's see if I can, there we go. We'll stop it. And it's easy to appreciate that there's much more flushing at 45 than at 15. And the point is, this is a dose response, and you get more flushing of dead space, which is probably one of the major ways high flow works to reduce work of breathing. And at least at these levels of flows, the pressure probably isn't so important. Now, there are some studies looking at higher flow rates. This is one by Rachel Park out of Australia, who's done a lot of work with high flow. And in the orange curve there, you're looking at the change in flow, rather in respiratory rate as the flow rate goes up. And you can see that once you get up to maybe about 50 or 60, the drop plateaus. But the green curve that's climbing to the right is the pressure curve. And we say that usually it's about 1 centimeter water pressure per 10 liters per minute flow. And that seems to hold up even up to about 100 liters per minute there on the right. And her contention was that these high flow rates give you enough pressure so that perhaps you're getting into the range you might get with non-invasive ventilation, and there could be more effect on oxygenation and so forth. But high flow does not sustain a steady pressure. When you inhale, the pressure comes down considerably. So the real physiologic significance is unclear. And also, if you open your mouth, the pressures come down. The bottom curve there is for extra end expiratory lung volume, and that does go up at the higher pressures, as you might expect, and that could help to improve oxygenation. But there's a cost, because this is another study published in Critical Care this past year on patients in an ICU who were on non-invasive techniques and were able to give ratings. And you can see at these high rates, the comfort rating goes down considerably. So, what is the ideal flow? Unclear, but I think you really need to give probably at least 45 liters a minute to get the dead space washing effect. And maybe you get a little bit more as you go up to 60. You probably don't get much more beyond 60. Once it's flushed, it's flushed. But you can get more pressure effect, and whether that's important or not remains to be seen. But I would shoot between 45 and 50. I do have some friends who early on in the pandemic were only giving 10 to 15. That was their guideline that they wanted to use to protect staff from the aerosol. And I tell them, that's not getting the physiologic benefit from high flow. and just don't call it high flow if you want to use it that way, but it's not high flow. And I think they're still doing it. They're just too concerned about the aerosol. So I'll stop there, and I do want to open it up to discussion. People, I'm sure, have many other thoughts about their experiences with high flow, and how they're using it in relation to proning and non-invasive bi-level type ventilation. So thank you.
So Nick, a couple of the people, talking about shortages. There have been shortages of sterile water for the heated humidifier systems, and the question has come up is, can we use distilled water? And I was sharing with some of the other people that 40 years ago, when I started doing this, the Children's Hospital in Cincinnati made its own distilled water, put it in glass bottles with black plastic caps, and we carried them around and filled up all the humidifiers with them. Maybe Chris, this is a better question for you, but from my standpoint, in terms of safety for the patient, sterile water isn't a problem. The question I think people have wondered is, sterile water or half normal saline, would that negatively impact the performance of the humidifier or create some problem with occlusion because of, in the case of half normal saline, the accumulation of salt?
Yeah, I think the half normal saline is a bad idea. I don't know why that's coming up, but in the lack of evidence, I would say that either sterile water or distilled water is probably fine. Distilled water presumably has had residue and tiny particles eliminated because of this distillation process. I started myself on some auto CPAP a few weeks ago, and I'm using distilled water nightly. So if it's bad, I shouldn't be able to give the talk. So I wouldn't have a lot of concern about that. I don't know what your thoughts on that would be, Rich.
No, I see no reason not to use distilled water. It's just a matter of, how are you going to get the distilled water into the humidifiers that have a bag feed system? And that's going to take some creativeness, I think. You said 45 liters a minute on the Friday call last week. I was kind of thinking out loud, the anatomic dead space is 150 milliliters in the average patient. And some of that is the trachea and the larynx. So it seems to me like we should be able to wash out the upper airway dead space at a flow much lower than 45 liters a minute. But in terms of realizing that oxygen conservation all of a sudden has become really important, Nick, can you say start at 30 and move up? Or
yeah, well that's how we've done it. In fact,
okay.
We published it. We're not actually doing it that way now, but we published a study on the complementary use of high flow in NIV, and we started off at 35. The thing is that at the end of the study, we were at 38. The therapists were enabled to titrate up if they want to, but the fact of the matter is you tend to stay where you started. If you look at the studies, many of them that have, as I'm sure you know, started at 50 liters a minute and then ended up pretty close to that. So I think part of what influences my thinking is the Stan Tatkoff study showing the dose response here, and you are getting, I think, significantly more dead space flushing at 45 than 30. Most of the effect on respiratory rate occurs when you go to 30, however. But I think if we're treating people with significant hypoxemia, one of the issues is you want to stay up with their inspiratory flow rate, and you're going to undershoot in a lot of patients if you start at 30. So, I generally start 45, 50. Most people tolerate it just fine. As far as the oxygen consumption is concerned, how much you're going to consume compared to somewhat lower levels. I think that's, a debatable issue, because there's a lot of other losses of oxygen along the way too. So I'd still push for a somewhat higher initial, granting that it's a debatable topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's in these cases, again, I agree under normal conditions, but in these cases, it's kind of like your retirement. Pennies make dollars over time. So if you have 10 patients, maybe Asha, how many patients do you have on high flow at any one time? If you have 10, and we heard that the one hospital's gone from once a month refills to every 3-day refills. Yeah, I agree. There are lots of things that can be done. Turn the oxygen flow meters off to the resuscitators. Make sure the oxygen's off to places that aren't necessary. Unplug anesthesia machines from the wall before everybody goes home at night. All kinds of things like that to prevent silly loss due to leaks. But I just haven't had enough experience doing it with high flow to know if 30 versus 40 versus 50 is the difference between intubation or not intubation.
I think 30 to 50 might be in some patients, but I can't prove it at a Cochrane level of evidence. But the effect on respiratory rate, I think, is quite important in high flow, and there is a significant reduction in that range. I'd be kind of interested to hear people's experience in relation to NIV, proning, or if anybody's been using the helmet at all. As you saw in Italy, 50% of their non-invasive cases were CPAP with helmet. Anybody been using it at all? We have a bunch of helmets that we acquired during our surge in the springtime, and we ended up using 3 of them. We used more of them on ourselves, playing around trying to figure out how to apply them. They're noisy, and most people don't get too claustrophobic, but we did put someone on a helmet who had an underlying panic disorder, and that was a disaster. But we also had one fellow an old Portuguese gentleman who didn't speak much English, so I guess it didn't matter that you couldn't really hear him over the thing, but he was on it for 4 days and avoided intubation. But our therapists just never caught on. They're much more difficult to put on and monitor than high flow, and so the preference for them was high flow. And I think you probably have to get over a hurdle there to get people comfortable with it, and there are a lot of competing choices. What about awake proning while using non-invasive approaches? The evidence base there is not very good, but we're certainly doing it. It's hard to study because it's difficult to get the dose, because you can think people are proning, but when you take your eyes off them, they flip themselves back over. So and a lot of people stay on their sides as opposed to fully prone.
Yeah, similar experience here. That's probably standard of care for us is to put them on and try and put them on their bellies as best we can, and they just don't stay there. I've tried it. I don't like it. I just can't lay in my belly either, and I understand it. It's interesting for us is and I'm going to bring it back to you a little bit, is in our ICU, it's unusual to have somebody on an other than an intubation. So I can't say I see a ton of them. All those are on our COVID wards. Do you have a threshold for putting a high flow in an ICU or a BiPAP in an ICU? Do you have a number or a level that says this person's got to be in there? We just put them on the ward until they come down to us intubated.
Yeah, we've been using an FiO2 threshold of 60% for a number of years, and we have had very little trouble on the floors with that. If your ICU beds get really tight, though, you may have to relax that a little bit. we also, because some of these patients, when they go sour, they can go sour pretty quickly. We want them in the ICU for close observation.
Wish I had the luxury. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was interesting hearing you all talk about the surges you're experiencing, because we got hammered in the spring, and at Tufts, our peak in April, we had 67 COVID patients on ventilators. The peak ventilator use, invasive ventilator use so far with this surge was 19, and but we still are having, we have about 60% of the number of patients in the hospital with COVID compared to last spring, but most of them are on regular floors. And, we're not seeing it as high a proportion requiring the ICU. The other difference is we have a lot more non-COVID patients in the hospital. So even though we have fewer COVID patients, we're still bursting at the seams. All right, so what about use of bi-level type NIV or CPAP via a face mask or something like that? Are people using those things?
I'll speak from experience. We travel that road and end up on BiPAP, also on the wards until they start to decompensate. And usually that decompensation comes as an altered mental status, where and brings them down to us. But it's certainly part of our armamentarium. And I was going to look at our numbers now, but we can have, on a COVID ward, we can have maybe 19, 20 high flows and 12 BiPAPs running on one of the wards, and they stay up there. But my experience is they usually end up seeing us down in the ICU. I'd be very interested in once they get to BiPAP. Anyway, anybody got another experience?
Well, I'd like to throw in and invite our respiratory therapist, Ray Daniels, to bring something up. We were talking earlier, and right now we're having trouble procuring circuits, high flow, BiPAP, everything's kind of in shortage mode. So I don't know if Ray is still on the line.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, if you want to put in your ask to the doctors to help out in conservation, regarding BiPAP, high flow, that transition.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we've noticed, and it's a little inconsistent all over the place. And I know there's a lot of factors that go into this. So it's been really great hearing about, using the high flow, and then we transition to BiPAP, and then we, end up transitioning to a ventilator. But I've seen it kind of all over the place. And I know sometimes patients crash faster than others. But we've had trouble trying to get high flow circuits in, and even BiPAP circuits and masks in. So it's just been a challenge for us to see someone go from high flow and then to BiPAP maybe for only an hour or two, and then they end up going to a ventilator. So I'm not really sure what can be done about conservation. I'm guessing there's no real hard, fast protocol for this either. So I was just wondering if there was any ideas anybody had about that, or if that's just something that we should expect to see.
Well, I don't know if you're doing it at your place, but we kind of jury rig a high flow system, which I'm showing you here, and we use the standard tubing. But what's different about it is we have a blender, oxygen blender, with an analyzer that's hooked onto it on a pole, and then we use the standard heated tubing, and the humidifier is right here. So the in port is this one here, and the out is here, and we stick filters in between here. I guess that's the filter there, and this is fairly easy to jury rig, and the humidifier can be used for a lot of different applications. So, we have a fair number of those, and, as long as you have the basic components, you don't have to have any special technology. Fisher Paykel, of course, manufactures an independent blower-based device, the Airvo, that some of you may have. that can be used inpatient as well, and may not consume quite as much oxygen as this one. But I think we have about 20 of these readily available, and then we can probably jury rig another 10 by pulling the components together. So, we can put a lot of people on high flow. I don't know, is anybody using something like this?
Yeah, I know Sharp Memorial has a few of those, but I think we're mostly on the Airvo now. We just bought 50 of those for our healthcare system down here. Before COVID hit, I had one of these devices. Now I have 14. But I like that older approach of what you have there, because it looks like it's just corrugated tubing that's been cut up.
Yeah, it's heated tubing. It has hot wires in it.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
All right.
Well, Dr. Hill, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We have most people still staying on the line. I had popped up a slide on how Ray MacGyvered something for because we are running out of sterile water in our state. And so, Ray, do you want to describe this a little? And if you have any questions.
I'm going to stop share so you can show your slide. Oh, there
okay.
Oh, hi. Yeah, we recognized early on that getting sterile water was going to be a problem. So we took a feeding bag, and when you cut it at the softer rubber part, you're able to spike that with either the heated vent circuit or the heated Airvo circuit. And we haven't had to use it routinely, but we trialed it up in the unit, and it worked great. So it enables you to, it was nice to hear about the distilled water thing, so it gives you the ability to use different water sources, if you get them in bottles that aren't spikeable, or, now if we have to, we've been using, reserving the water for our high flows and using HMEs on our vents, but we might have to, run down to the grocery store and pick up some distilled water if it gets as bad as we think it might.
I like it.
Thank you, Ray. And Dr. Hill, thank you for that kind of blessing on that MacGyvering that's going on in California. I think we need that. A lot of people are feeling that need. Is it okay to do it? Or it's hard sometimes to just flip that switch over. So I think that's useful for this group.
Hey, Asha.
Yeah, Rich.
This is Rich. I understand that Bayer has an EUA to use their sterile water for injection as the water for a heated humidifier. So I don't know if that's more plentiful for you guys or not.
I don't know. Anybody else?
Rich, I think we're at the point where we'll take what we can get.
Yeah, Asha, this is Chris Hutchinson from Fisher & Paykel. Just to add in a couple of quick things there. The water that's classified for either sterile or inhalation or irrigation is all more than suitable for humidification. So all of those, and distilled and sterile, it's all capable for humidification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate that.
I mean, if we really wanted to get right down to being technical, you could take essentially, any water source, because it's incapable of transmitting any virus or bacteria. It can't. The water molecules can't carry anything. But obviously, as Rich quite rightly said earlier, and so did Nick, we don't want to have any undue sources of other pathogens that could be entered into the airstream. So yeah, distilled or sterile irrigation or inhalation water can all be used.
Thank you. Are there any, I know we probably have more questions than we have answers, but if, I know we've gone over, and I really appreciate everyone. Denny, do you have any concluding thoughts?
This is awesome, and it does show you that we are trying to cope with this thing, and there's there's more things out there than I knew, and it's great to share everybody's pain. So I really appreciate all the call-ins too. That was wonderful to hear.
So thank you all, and next week we'll get together, and I'm gonna see if I can, or if Rich or someone will try to reach out to maybe Louis Rubinson. He was in New Jersey at the early phase, and they had to surge to 300 beds like in a day, and turn entire wards into ICUs, and how he dealt with the piping and all of that. So I'll see if he might be able to call in and talk to us. And then we'll have some more discussions on maybe staffing. And we thank Arzu, thank Dr. Hill, and thank all of you for hanging in there tonight, and wish you all a good weekend.